classical systems of objective idealism arose on the basic foundation that the individual is separated from or independent of the overall culture of humanity, and more broadly, the transformation of universal products of human activity, both material and cultural, into a force independent of people's will and consciousness. This alienation of the product of activity and the actual forms of human activity led to the fact that forms of human activity in effect are counterposed to the individual and imposes on them a force of exterior necessity, and hence can be represented as the power and capacity of some supra-individual subject, God, the absolute spirit, the transcendental ego, the world spirit, and so on. As Marx has shown, such alienation underlies both religion and idealism. In both forms of social consciousness, human beings are aware of their own powers and abilities, but are so under the guise of some other mystical being, but are so under the guise of some other mystical being other than themselves. This religious and philosophical alienation of human abilities is not a product of ignorance or the inability to think things through, as the French materialists and Feuerbach believed, but a particular reflection of a real factor, of the real self-alienation of human beings under the conditions of the unbridled development of social relations, the real relation of the individual to the social and human abilities and forms of activity in these conditions. The autonomy of public culture in general and its organizational form from the individual, and more broadly, the general transformation of products of social production, both material and cultural, into a particular social force counterposing individuals and dominating their will and consciousness, is reflected in religion and idealism. It is for this reason that, quote, social power is not voluntary, but has come about naturally, unquote. And this social force also opposes and therefore also, quote, appears to these individuals not as their own united power, but as an alien force existing outside them, of the origin and goal of which they are ignorant, which they thus are no longer able to control, which on the contrary passes through a peculiar series of phases and stages independent of the will and action of humans, nay, even being the prime governor of these. This power of the social body over the individual is directly encountered and appears in the form of the state, the political system of society, in the guise of moral, ethical, and legal restrictions, norms of social behavior, and then in aesthetic, logical, and other norms and criteria, with the demands and restrictions expressed in them, and in that which is socially sanctioned, an individual is compelled from childhood to consider things more carefully than with the immediately perceived appearance of individual things and situations, or through the organic desires, drives, and needs of the body.
Thank you very much. Shall we take a minute to see if we can raise some questions?
May I say some words?
Yeah, sure.
Last time we noticed already that the starting of this paragraph, classical systems of objective idealism arose on the basic foundation that the individual is separated from or independent of. We discussed with Sasha that the situation is vice versa. Not individuals are independent of the overall culture, but vice versa. Culture became independent of separate individuals. This thing was not. Yes.
I think we sent out a slightly more updated version. I think Benny had a slightly earlier draft, but I think for now we are trying to raise a few questions about the content, but thank you. Yeah, so it's the culture that's separate from individuals.
And I have one more thing to say about this text. In the second paragraph, the one but last line, that an individual is compelled from childhood to consider things more carefully than, and so on. To consider, it means something like to contemplate, but Ilyenkov says in this place about activity. Maybe it will be more exact to translate to be considerate, not to consider. I'm not sure, but I'm afraid it is not exactly.
Yeah, so it would be good to just focus, to put the translation issues to one side for now and try to, see if we have any questions about the content, and then perhaps through that we can get to the meaning via different routes rather than the semantics.
Yes,
Penny.
yes.
Yeah. I would like to say a little bit about this. I think this section is enormously helpful to us as we try to understand how so many of our fellow citizens are floundering really with struggling to understand what is happening in the world in terms of their own both in their individual and social lives. And when we see, when we read this paragraph about the power really of the state as the expression of this alienation, or the implementer or enforcer, you could say, of this alienation through its support of and enforcing of the existing system of production, then you start to think, see a little more clearly why there is so much power in strange and bizarre conspiracy theories, for example. Something I think we're all trying to understand, that because when there is a breakdown really in the state, as we are seeing now, with the deep crisis of the state, its inability to make of us, we've just talked about where it has a health, it enforces a health system which does not help us and improve our health. Then you can see how people see that as a result of this breakdown of that hegemony, start to have to start to think in a way independently of other things, and also how other forces step into the breach to put forward these bizarre and dangerous alternatives, and at the same time how people's the fragility and really profound alienation of people's laboring lives, their working lives, as well as the deeply alienating force of the education system, how this has left people really with a profound difficulty because of the need to overcome, as it were, this very alienating cultural and importantly working situation that they find themselves in. And I think the pandemic and these lockdowns have also, because of the impact that it's had on people's ability to socialize and to come together in a real way, has deepened this crisis even further. And when we start to try to work out why do people think the things they think, I think, this expression of, how the ideal comes out of our social and political lives, as opposed to being just some simple reflection of the objective world in our thoughts. I think that it's a very profound and helpful thing as we try and work out how to go forward.
Thank you. Bill and then George.
Thank you. The only point I want to make is that number one, I saw Strauss in that remark about projection. Projecting God, pardon, projecting yourself as an image in God, in a garden. But I don't know. Excuse me. But I don't know if that's the source. But more importantly, the word considering was too intellectual for my Anglophone tastes. Young children aren't really doing that. Well, and it depends on what kind of age and what group Ilyenkov was talking about at that point, at that very point.
Thanks. Bill.
That's it.
Yeah,
That's it.
can I just two bits about the text in the second paragraph that Penny read out. So where's the quotation from, which is in quotation marks, social power is not voluntary, but has come about naturally?
Yeah. Good point.
And what does it mean? So that's the first one. And then the second one is just the last sentence of that second paragraph seems to suggest to me, well, perhaps it's wrong to suggest that in a way activity and ideality come about with the state. So it raises for me the question of what's the deep time, what's the phylogenetic, or does he include a phylogenetic question in how ideality, the ideal has come about, or does it arise with the state? So those two questions came from that final paragraph.
Giuliano?
Yeah, I did want to, it is a translation point, but it is a sort of significant point as well, that the rereading the word consider, I would say something like to take into account or to reckon with is probably a better understanding of shitatsa is to consider not as to contemplate, but as to take into account or to reckon with a kind of force. The other point is with the translation, which is from the German ideology. The Russian is very different. So I I cited the same passage in the German ideology, but the Russian has, instead of social power, it's совместная деятельность, so joint activity. So it's very different. But I in all these cases, and there was at the very beginning there was another translation which in English was, I think, mind, and in Russian is head. So that's some so here, if you read social power is not voluntary, the Russian is really joint activity or collective activity or something like that. So there are a few points where the translation it needs to be we need to add sort of some kind of explanation or a footnote to fix it. It
Sure.
can.
Okay, and Karina?
Yes, about this very passage. It's very helpful, I think, as Penny mentioned, in relation to the present situation, because the fact that people don't see all these connections. You cannot see all the connections between the powers above you and the human activity that has created those powers. Ilyenkov is stressing that the alienated power of things like the state and religion is they're able to exercise that power because they appear to be above the human society. Well, they are in some respects above it, but also it's the fact that this then makes them eternally fixed. You can't see the mechanism whereby these powers exert their power, and they become naturalized, like a natural fixed thing that nature has done, not that human beings have done. I think that's why it's important. Thank you.
I did also myself want to come back because I think it's an interesting contrast in terms of Ilyenkov's project. If we compare it to some of the ways that these dynamics have been picked up in continental thoughts, it's interesting how for Ilyenkov it's a process that's where in some ways there's some positivity, there's some way to say, well, here is this alienation, but there's perhaps, we'll come to it later, there's some implication that we can become aware of it, whereas there's a similar dynamic in lots of continental thought. So I don't know, like, so Lacan has the big other, so we assume this big other, but actually there is no big other, it's our relations to others. But what Lacan says is, if we got rid of the big other, then that would be the worst thing for us. We would be nothing. We would lose the thing that's most precious to us, which is our individuality and the individuality of our drives. Whereas here at the end, he's talking about organic desires, organic drives. Well, and in fact, this is what Katie's book talks about, that in some ways we don't need this individuality that's a lot of the continental thought is saying, is like we would just collapse or have a crisis. So it's kind of interesting, like, to think what that positive project would be like. Do we agree that it's possible to not have that alienation, or is it necessary in our life in some ways? But perhaps we can read on a bit, or any points on that?
Yes, one point. Do very small groups of people acting together have that alienation? Where's the limit? That's it.
Interesting.
I think my point was, sorry.
Yep. Bill, then Paul, then we'll carry on reading.
My point about the phylogenetic dimension of this, would hunter-gatherers have some corollary of this external alienated force? Probably closer to religion as we know it now. But yeah, that's just the question.
Paul?
Oh, yes, the first couple of words in the second paragraph we just read, the autonomy of public culture. Giuliano, I think maybe not autonomy, probably maybe overdoing it. I think maybe something relative independence might be better than autonomy, because it's both there and it has the appearance of autonomy, but it isn't autonomous. But I think autonomy is too strong a word, but maybe that is the translation. So I just think a kind of more relative independence, or the apparent independence of public culture might be better. I also think this question of the state, which comes up towards the end of that paragraph, is extremely important, because it is, from a Marxist standpoint, the state, which is the repository of all the social relations in society, and is itself an alienating thing. So here you have a kind of double alienation, the alienation of people from this culture, reinforced by a state which itself is alienated from the rest of society, has a relationship to the rest of society, but also appears to sit above it. So I think there's a kind of double alienation there. which is worth considering. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's read on for two more, then we can come back to some of these points. Anyone willing to read the next two paragraphs?
Yeah.
Thanks, Bill. That'll be great.
The riddle of the emergence of the spiritualist view of the ideal clearly shines through in Platonic doctrine. Human life activity, Plato states, is governed not directly by laws of nature, but by laws of government. Herein lies the difference between humans and animals. By the state, Plato not only meant the legal or political structure, but the whole system of general forms of culture that directly condition an individual's behavior, her or his will and consciousness, including grammatical norms, rules of industry and art, religious rituals, etc. As such, the state, according to Plato, stands opposed to the individual as a special supernatural reality, which she is forced from childhood to join through the path of imitation. The issue of knowledge became quite different in the light of this. Before Plato, knowledge was understood as the inner condition of the individual. Therefore, an attempt was made to resolve the question of knowledge based on a study of the relationship between individuals and their environment, or the relation of the individual soul, understood in a physical way, to the external world. Plato understood the person not as an isolated body, but as a personality formed by the state, that is, a human being who assimilates general cultural norms, obeying them. The individual came to be regarded primarily as a singular embodiment of the state, or as the state embodied in the individual as authorized representative. This reflects a common idealistic turn of mind. The faceless state appears as subject, whereas the individual is merely its tool. Therefore, the relation between knowledge and reality became that of the relation between immediate social norms and the forms of human culture, individualized in an individual to the world of single, sensuously perceived bodies, of which the individual body forms a part. It was not coincidental that Hegel praised Plato precisely for the fact that in his teaching, quotation, reality of the spirit, insofar as it is opposed to nature, is presented in its highest truth, presented as the organization of a state, end of quotation, and not in the organization of the individual spirit.
Any questions or comments on this passage or overall? Yanis.
Hi to everyone. I think it's very important, this passage, because it describes the contradiction and the opposition between materialism and idealism since the antiquity. I think that we have to read this sentence and we have to go deeper, if we can, to an understanding of the mutual and reciprocal interaction between idealism and materialism. I want to refer to Marx's thesis of Feuerbach. In the first thesis, Marx writes that in idealism, it was developed the active side of in the active side of human activity by idealism. That means that the idealism apprehends human activity from its active sides. That's very important because at the level of the state, if we consider, for example, the people who are joining the state, and their activity is transmitted by the state. Those people are, we can say, the most historical individuals. So there is a rational kernel in idealism. That's my point of view. That idealism precise and defines an actual aspect of human activity through the use of the mechanism of society. So it's very interesting for me to see how practical materialism surpasses this opposition between classic materialism and idealism, and how in dialectical materialism we have a kind of union between the active side, that means the rational kernel of idealism, and materialism. And I think this subject and this topic is not so much developed until our days, because our days we face, for example, enormous processes of production of subjectivities, and for example the scandal with Cambridge Analytica, or all this stuff, how the new mechanism of internet, big data, etc., how can persuade and control the opinion and the people's activity. So it's very important to understand, and also from this perspective, the whole problem. Thank you.
Thanks. Anyone else? Well, I mean, in a way, that's a Cambridge Analytica is a funny one, because it even more so actually confirms what Ilyenkov was saying, because what Cambridge Analytica said they were doing is identifying what personality type people had, and then manipulating them by identifying their personality type. But that isn't how they actually worked. How they worked is people believing that there was such a thing as personality types, and therefore giving them lots of money, etc. So as the court case recently found out, where they were unethical is convincing people that it was possible to individually manipulate by identifying the type of person you were. It's massively over exaggerated, the power of big data. We have all of the algorithmic power. If there were, so if Hume was right, then neural net AI would already be manipulating us to buy things endlessly with no self-control. Paul.
Just briefly, and taking up Yanis's point about subjectivities and the power of the state and so on, in reference to Cambridge Analytica, but this is the Brexit discussion and Brexit referendum we had in the United Kingdom, the whole of the state, all the state institutions and the state, the political parties in the state, all of them campaigned vociferously against Brexit. So the fact that Brexit, the people took the opposite view for all sorts of reasons we won't go into here, also shows the vulnerability of the state. I think that's another important point. The state has vulnerabilities, serious vulnerabilities, and things do not work out according to plan, increasingly so. Thank you.
Is there any other quotes from the text we want to pick out and highlight or ask a question about? Or any sentence that is unclear? Penny? Oh, sorry, Carl hasn't spoken yet, so I'll come to Carl then, to you if that's okay, Penny. Carl first, yeah.
So I wanted to ask about one sentence I struggled with, which comes just, I think, just before the highlighted quote there, where he says, "Realistic turn of mind. The faceless state appears as subject, whereas the individual is merely its tool." So that I get, I think. And then after that, therefore, the relation between knowledge and reality became that of the relation between immediate social norms and the form of human culture, individualized in an individual, to the world of single, sensuously perceived bodies, of which the individual body forms a part. But I just had a little bit of trouble understanding that. Is he suggesting that knowledge is considered to be sort of separate and apart from the world of things, or at least prior to them somehow, and then it's sort of compared with individual things, or is there a better way to read that? I was just curious what other people thought.
Yeah, let's come back to interpreting that very dense bit of a sentence you pointed out. Yeah, but Penny first, and then perhaps someone can come back to Carl to untie.
No, that's fine. It would be more helpful to look at.
Sure. Yeah. Does anyone think they can say anything about that part to do with sensuously perceived bodies, of which the individual body forms a part? Yeah, but like what's the body?
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
Yeah, exactly what kind of bodies does he mean? Restricted to humans, or me and the sun, or something like that? That was my problem with that paragraph.
Karina, how would you approach that?
That's an interesting point, George, but I didn't what kind of body, but the way I saw it was that Plato, he didn't mediate between the above, the ideal, the state, and the sensuous human being. It was just a direct connection. But there isn't, the direct connection between the abstract ideal and the sensuous human being. In reality, there are many mediations. We don't just directly relate to these. For example, we don't directly relate to a state, or there are many mediated processes and things that, for example, a child has to learn and become accustomed to and interact with before all these connections are even can exist. And I think Plato, being at the beginning of philosophy, really was theorizing. He was trying to grapple with the fact that there are these different spheres. There's the sphere of mind and the ideal and the consciousness, and then there's the sphere of direct sensuousness, and they're not the same thing. They are connected, and we can't have one without the other. We can't have the ideal without the sensuous, but they're not the same. And I think the passage is kind of dwelling on that problem, that the lack of mediation in because of natural science in Plato's time was only just beginning, and all these connections couldn't be understood.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's interesting. Anyone either wants to come back on that, or
Andrew wants to speak.
Oh, Andrew, yeah.
Just on that, to me, that what's being said there, in the senses that was queried, is not so much critical of the Hegelian turn. He's more contrasting an earlier idea of the relationship between mind and the world, a knowledge relationship, where it's just an individual mind and the world out there, to, in this what's quite a complicated sentence, but in the end it's not that difficult. All it's saying is now we understand that the mind is a collective thing given in the state and individualized in the individual. So now we understand the mind differently than as just you have one, I have one. We understand it as social culture, objective culture, individualized in an individual. And so now that's what the mind is. What's knowledge of? What does the mind have knowledge of? Bodies. individual bodies. So he's saying before you had this turn of a collective mind, you have an individual mind that has knowledge of individual bodies. Now he's saying in this sentence, we have this collective mind, and it's the collective mind which has some relationship called knowledge with individual bodies. So collective mind has knowledge of individual bodies. That's how I understood that sentence.
But I do also think it is really, I completely agree, but it's also is really helpful what Karina said. So to use Vygotsky's word, he describes it as a parallelism where there's kind of before like two worlds where something in the world of the ideal corresponds to the world in the material. And this is really interesting because you can have lots of relations of like bodies to bodies. So it's not two things necessarily. It's like just the fact that it's not a dyad of parallel things is a really big revolution in thought.
I agree with that. Just while I'm speaking, I'm uneasy with the discussion this week and the last time. I think it's really important to consider what Ilyenkov's topic is, and so what his methodology is, and what he's trying to achieve. And what I just said, my interpretation arises out of my view on where Ilyenkov's coming from. He's trying to understand the relationship between mind and world, or thought and being. It's a core issue in philosophy. He's not trying to give us a treatise on the state. He's absolutely not trying to help us understand Cambridge Analytica. It's an incredibly complicated, concrete issue where you need to understand philosophy and capitalism and late capitalism and so on and so forth. There's a lot of layers of mediation there. I agree that it's very interesting what he has to say about the state and so on and so forth. But from the point of view of interpretation, especially when it gets difficult, I think it's really important to remember what Ilyenkov's trying to do is look at the relationship between thought and being and philosophy, the most abstract possible philosophical question. And all of this is with that aim. And that's why it makes sense to me that his key point in this sentence is, he's thinking thought, being. Well, thought here is collective thought, culture. That's the big change with Plato. You get this thought is no longer an individual thing, it's a collective thing. Okay, sorry, I'll shut up.
Should we read the next bit unless anyone has a comment on this section?
Yeah, one comment on what Andrew just said. Excuse me, I wondered about that when I read it. And it seemed to me that there's a progress in those paragraphs where he starts out, I think, just talking about, let's say, individual perception and how my mind adapts to seeing a chair or something of that nature. And several paragraphs later, it's the state in Plato. So, I mean, I would just like to modulate what Mr. Brown said, that it's not all the same level as the highest at the end.
Thank you. Should we try and get two more paragraphs done? Yeah. Is anyone willing to read the next two? No, we're reluctant at the moment. You're like my year 9 English class.
Go ahead and read. I just have like a little bit of background noise here, so
Okay.
Sorry if that becomes annoying. Maybe I can pass it off to someone else. That's right.
Mm-hmm.
The relation of spirit to nature in Plato became like the relation to humanized nature. That is, of all the sensuously perceived forms of things created by a human in relation to virgin nature. In this formulation, the activity of the human in relation to nature comes to the fore. Is it? Can you guys hear talking in the background? Okay, sorry, I might pass it off to someone else.
That's fine. I mean, I'm happy to read it myself if we're not going to. Right. In this formulation, the activity of the human in relation to nature comes to the fore, yet the real, objective, practical activity of a person is understood by idealism as a result, an external expression of the activity of those general norms and categories, the singular representative of which is an individual. The universal cultural norms, which Plato calls ideas, organized by the individual conscious will, and through her, and through the order of things within the human world, act as prototypes, as active samples, forming the substance of nature, including the physical being of human beings themselves. Therefore, the natural material for objective idealism acts only as pure potential, as passive, shapeless clay, formed by the creative power of ideal prototypes. The ground for such mystification is that all common images, without exception, fixed in speech and forms of spatial imagination, effectively emerge not in an individual's act of passive contemplation untouched by the work of nature, but in a process of a practical objective transformation of nature by the social human being, by society. They emerge and function as forms of social and human determination of an individual's purposeful will, namely as forms of dynamic activity. At the same time, all common images crystallize in intellectual culture quite unintentionally and independently of an individual's will and consciousness, albeit through his or her activities. In contemplation, they appear as forms of things created by human activity, or as imprints superimposed on natural material by human activity, as forms of purposeful will alienated in external matter. I think that's probably already a really rich paragraph to pause at. So perhaps we can have any comments or interpretations of that, because I think that's sort of very much what it's been building towards. Yanis.
I want to ask about the translation about substance in Platon, because in Greek philosophy there is no substance. Substance is something other that comes with contemporary philosophy. In antiquity there is no word substance.
Any other questions or comments here?
I'm just trying to look up the word. Where is it about the Plato quote?
Maybe Ilyenkov himself he used this concept substance. I don't know, but
Yeah, I'm just trying to see
this remark, but that in Greek philosophy we don't have the term, the concept substance.
Yeah, just where in the paragraph
does not exist.
Yeah, where in the paragraph is this?
The universal cultural norms, which Plato calls ideas, organized by the individual conscious will, and through her and through the order of things within the human world, act as prototypes, as active samples, forming the substance of nature, including the physical being of human beings themselves.
Okay. Okay. I'll try to. The problem is that my paragraphs are not Ilyenkov's, because Ilyenkov there are certain paragraphs that run to a few pages, so that's why.
That's fine. We'll give you time to look at that. We'll see if anyone else has a comment.
Вещество in this context is not a substance, yes. Maybe just material.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think there's a particular problem with вещество because it was the one term that I really had a difficulty in deciding how to translate. So
substrate.
Yes, substrate might be in some circumstances it might be you could read this as substrate. The very last words in the paragraph is also vicious force. So
Okay.
take it into account that it might not be matter or substance, but substrate.
And Karina? You're still muted, Karina, at the moment.
Cool.
Karina, wait.
So yeah, I've unmuted. Yeah, whatever. I mean, I'm sure that Yanis is correct, but I don't think it really changes the meaning of what Ilyenkov's written, because I think he's trying to say that Plato makes everything a form of the ideal, including nature and matter. Material. For Plato, the material world is idealized, so to speak. I mean, it's a lesser. He had this idea of ideal forms, and everything that we were looking at was about a poor reflection of the world, an unideal reflection. So it was all part of this. So, whether it's material, substrate, or matter, it's the same meaning, because he's trying to explain how for Plato there was nothing. The question of substance, matter, was excluded as an independent thing. It couldn't exist independently. Thanks.
I don't, yeah. Karina?
Yeah, George, go on.
Cool. Yeah, again, to my Anglophone ears, that use of substance seems to be more, excuse me, more Ilyenkov than any particular philosophical reference. It's just a word that he used. I would use something like stuff if I did it. It's non-committal, put it that way, philosophically.
Yeah, thank you. I guess the important bit, which is sort of new, introduced here, is human activity, or as imprints superimposed on natural material by human activity, as forms of the purposeful will alienated in external matter. How do people interpret that? Because that's sort of, I guess, what has been building up to. Andrew?
Yeah, I think though that I agree there's an issue with the term substance, because if you think about the idea that natural material is just the clay, and then the ideal then forms the clay, it's not right if you take that view to say that the ideal is the clay itself. The natural material is the clay; it's formless, and it's given form by the ideal. So I did struggle looking at it again with that term substance. I did struggle a bit earlier in that sentence when it says that the individuals organize the ideas. It seems to be that individuals are organizing. Should be that the ideal is organizing through individuals, not the individuals are doing something through ideas. So I struggled with those two elements of that sentence. But to answer your question, I think then it is fairly clear that you've got this natural material, which is passive and is being formed by the ideal, understood as these Platonic ideals.
Thank you. Any comments on this one before we see if we can do one more paragraph?
I have a comment as
Yes,
well.
yeah.
I just want to add a comment and to say that idea in Platon is not something uniquely individual. It's something ontological. Idea is ontological. It belongs to the ontological level, not only to the individual level. That's it.
Thanks. I think we could probably do the next two. So from people generally, only engage with nature as such to the extent that it is somehow involved in the process of social work, turns into matter, a means, a condition of active human activity, even the starry sky, in which human labor really does not yet transform anything, becomes the subject of human attention and contemplation only when transformed by society into a way of orienting time and space into the tool of the life activity of the social and human body, into the organ of its body, its natural clock, compass, and calendar. Universal forms, the laws of natural matter, really come through and therefore are recognized insofar as this matter has really turned into building material for the inorganic human body, the objective body of civilization, and therefore the universal forms of things in themselves directly appear to humans as active forms of this inorganic human body. Therefore, it's not difficult for a Platonic or Hegelian idealist to mystify the universal forms and laws of nature, revealed and tested by human practice as forms of an expediently operating rational will, as imprints superimposed upon the substance of nature, as product of the alienation of forms of this external will in natural matter. It was in this inverted form that idealism portrayed the real fact of human activity in relation to nature, which the theory of pre-Marxist materialism did not consider. The chief defect of all previous materialism, that of Feuerbach included, is that of things, reality, sensuousness are conceived only in the form of the object or of contemplation, but not as sensuous human activity, practice, not subjectively. Hence, it happened that the active side, in contradiction to materialism, was set forth by idealism, but only abstractly, since, of course, idealism does not know real sensuous activity as such. Any comments? Well, this bit at the start is interesting to do with saying, well, even the starry sky, because it's something where we would think there isn't any activity, and it's something that Siav Azari, who's also part our group, often has written about, and I do kind of wonder about that, like the scientific implications of that, because isn't, like, in some ways science predicts things according to laws, and is that the same as it being discovered through our orientation of time and space? I think there's something to do with laws there potentially that complicates these things for me, but perhaps I'm misreading that. And okay, so right, there's substance again there. Any comments or questions that arose? Or interpretations of what it means? Anything we want to pick out as significant? It, of course, ends with the famous Marx quote.
Can I? It's going to take a bit. It takes a bit working through, but I'll make one comment relating this to Backhurst's interpretation, David Backhurst's interpretation of Ilyenkov. The way I read Backhurst, at least in a lot of his earlier work, his main book, and quite a lot of the material, although he keeps developing in a positive way, is broadly speaking making the mistake that Ilyenkov's pointing out, that the idealists make. What Bacchus, my view, ends up with is the objective forms of labour are just expressions of ideas, and so in the end, there's no natural material constraint. Labour isn't having to labour against a real world with real laws which constrain it. It's a pure expression of ideas. Now, there's lots of other elements. David Bacchus, so the main scholar of key Ilyenkov scholar in the West. So that's really important. So I read these passages of Ilyenkov as very important, because if I had got a chance to chat more with David, I'd be going through this with him and saying, look, it's not the case that there's just the objects that you produce, that humans have produced, are just expressions of the mind. They're not. Why? Because they're constrained by the laws of nature, and you've got to know the laws in order to be able to create something which is useful. So that's just one angle. I only filled that angle in because there wasn't anybody else saying anything, so I thought I'd get it in while I could.
Excuse me. I had a question on that point too. I'm sorry that my voice is cracking, but it's okay. What is the meaning in that? Damn it. What is the meaning there of the phrase universal?
In the
Connects with Andrew.
Yeah, any ideas? Near the ends, in universal forms, the laws of nature, natural matter really come through. So what are universal forms?
So that ties in with what I just said. Oh yes, yes. Someone want to speak?
No, Andrew, go ahead. Go ahead. Unless there's somebody else there.
There's someone in the chat, isn't there?
Oh, is that okay?
I think it was me.
No, I think that was just.
Okay. So the laws of nature are universal. So through practical activity, we uncover the laws of nature, cover lots of other things, but with universal laws of nature, you get universal forms of activity. So the thing is, as you labour and you learn, your forms of activity become more and more universal as you understand imperfectly, but ever better, the laws of nature. I mean, there's lots of other things going on as well, but that's how I understand the term universal here.
Can I say something? What about the word directly? Some laws of nature seem not at all directly accessible to me, even if I understand the theory. The phrase is far too broad for my mind.
It is because you can adjust natural forms of activity, because you are grown up already in human forms. So nature cannot be accessible for you immediately. Marx wrote that a human being cannot appropriate from the nature anything before he will be appropriated by his community.
Yeah, and I definitely agree. Andrew expressed far better the point that I was trying to make about the essay that Chavez wrote, agreeing with Bacchus, where that interpretation of Ilyenkov would suggest that, quote Bacchus, quoting McDowell, that there's a space of reasons, that the ideal is sort of the horizon of our access to the world, and basically it's there are aspects of the ideal that are related to each other, rather than like there isn't any way for it isn't that natural laws are forming ideas. It's that there are relations of within the ideal that are always like it. There's a kind of a totality where everything can be subsumed without need for explanation of natural laws forming the idea. It's ideas relating to other ideas. Yeah, Suresh.
Yes, I think the thing that someone said about universal forms, I think Engels talks about in Anti-Turing, he defines dialectics as the general form of motion of nature, society, and human mind. So in that way, I think universal forms, Ilyenkov is talking about that. Like we, by acting upon nature, by our productive activity, discover the general forms in which nature exists. I mean, it's nature, its being. So I think by working upon nature. So in that sense, if I'm not wrong, he's talking about the universal forms.
Thanks.
In the sense of dialectics as being the general forms, general laws of motion of nature, society, and mind.
I think, yeah, we have time for a few more comments.
I like the space of reasons idea. I think that if you work that out, you have, let's say, interconnections among things that you've already discovered that you might not know about when you discovered it. And then in the course of scientific research, these things become clearer and clearer. So what is the ideal then? Is it a kind of regulative notion of very advanced state of what we can be? Is that it?
Of what we can what?
Of what we can become with unlimited knowledge, or rather unlimited acquisition of knowledge by science and whatever.
Interesting.
It's a Kantian point,
Yeah.
Alexander wanted to speak. Sure.
Oh,
Carl has had his hand up for some time.
oh, sorry. Yeah, please go ahead.
I don't mind if someone else wanted to jump in too. That's fine. I just had a comment, really, a thought about this. In Hegel's Science of Logic, in the section on teleology, he actually comes very, very close to saying what Ilyenkov is saying here as well. And he uses ideal to describe that process of human activity and purpose universalizing the object of nature, right? And so the object of nature becomes ideal when it is sort of posited as the means for human activity and for activity of the mind, right? And so there's already, and this is I find this interesting because Hegel already, allows that there's a process occurring before it's posited as ideal, but it is that moment where it becomes the means of human activity. For example, when we begin to refer to the sky as part of our calculations and our calendar and so on and so forth, that it becomes idealized in that activity with the object, which is already doing whatever it's doing, right? It's already has its own objective process, but it becomes brought under or becomes idealized in our activity. So it's just kind of interesting to me how really close Hegel is to saying the same thing in that section.
Thanks. Anyone else? Or about any of the reading we've done as part of this section, because this is sort of the concluding bit. Sure. Yeah, Andrew.
Maybe to state the obvious, I mean, the obvious point is that we've got Kantian categories and Hegelian absolute spirit, And clearly that's what's at stake here. What Ilyenkov is doing is dealing with those. So the question, what is the ideal and so on, at the end of the day, it's about that. It's about what do you do with Kant's categories and what do you do with what Hegel did with them, absolute spirit, whatever you call it. And this is it. This is the big, you know, the most abstract expression of how Ilyenkov deals with it. So I don't think we'll quite fully grasp every nuance of it in the next few minutes, because if we did, that would be quite something.
Indeed, yeah. Well, one bit that I have, what I think is interesting, that I wonder what it means is, at the same time, all common images crystallize in intellectual culture. So I know it's something that Ilyenkov comes back to, but that word images and how we're supposed to interpret it, because there's a sort of Bergsonian interpretation of a crystallizing image, which is explicitly non-representational and not about reasons, but about affectivity. And I wonder what is this crystallization of an image? Karina.
Yeah, that's a good question. What is meant by crystallization? And just to try and bring together Andrew's and Kirill's points, if I can try. Yes, if we can crack this in one session, we can shut down the group. Sorry, but no, this, and also what Suresh said was in line with this question of, as I understood Andrew's and Kirill's point about Bacchus, are these images, these crystallizations, just something that are going around in our head, and you know, that is one against the other, and this is what thought is, this is the ideal. And Ilyenkov, and picking up, as Suresh said, on Engels as well, that these are not, this is just, this is the world of the ideal, but it is it exists in the realm of the real and of the material world, and that this, and our connection with it is through practical activity, and that's something that's outside of, it's the connection. It's both ideal and not ideal. If we're doing like this image that Ilyenkov uses of the sculpting of a vase with the clay, and then it becomes something ideal. And how does it do that? It does it through the hands of the artist or the potter. Thanks. And just to say, we've got another 15 minutes, and we'll have a bit at the end, but I'll hand over to Kirill.
Paul.
I think you can also read this crystallization in intellectual culture by, you know, a repetition of human activity and repetition of this ideal, you know, the ideal in activity. It does create a social, material existence independent of the individual, that does exist as part of social being. There is this crystallized culture, and it is the result partially of this. You know, it's we're just looking at it again. Common images by Marx talks about this repetition of practice to create something which then becomes material and existing outside of the individual, but as a result of the practice of the individual. So I think we could be talking about social forms of social being here. I think that's quite important in relation to you know, this alienation process that is referred to earlier in this paper. So I think you could think about it like that, perhaps.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the exact same phrase is used by Vygotsky as well. He talks about the crystallization in culture and crystallized imagination, and I think potentially. So Bill was asking earlier about like, well, how does this sort of, what's the process by which this is formed? Like, and I think potentially we could read even more into that. So if it was more the kind of Bergson interpretation, Deleuze talks about this a lot, that a crystal is actually something that's formed in an interesting process of like seeding and going out in all kind of directions in quite interesting ways. There's a kind of an image of a kind of a network that is implied in the crystal, that on the one hand it's sort of something which is fossilized and solid, but on the other hand it's something that's constantly seeding off into multiple directions. So potentially you could even read that word crystal even deeper. Okay, Ralph, did you want to make that point? Oh, sorry, and Suresh, I'll come back to you as well. No, okay. And then straight to Suresh.
No. Okay. Colin has already made that point.
Oh, okay.
Can we read one more paragraph and then draw it to a close after that, or not read another paragraph?
Okay.
Actually, can I just make one point? Because it's important, and again, it's a general point. So crystallize is also used in Marx's discussion of the value form in Capital. And a lot of these terms are used in that discussion. And we're going to have to bear that in mind, because what that means, in my view, is that we can get so far in interpreting what Ilyenkov's saying here, but we do need, unfortunately, to get to the point where we're also understanding how Ilyenkov understands the value form in Capital, because there's a relation between them. I don't believe you can understand the one without the other.
Thanks, yeah. Okay, so one more paragraph then. Therefore, it is not difficult.
But Carol, Miguel said he'd like to speak,
great.
You have to tell him where to start, because he's at work.
Yeah, just from therefore, it is not difficult.
I think you need to explain a bit more where to start.
Oh, so after the bit that's highlighted in yellow, paragraph is, therefore, it is not difficult for a Platonic or Hegelian.
Excuse me?
Hi, so I start at people generally, or I start at therefore? I'm sorry. Okay. Therefore, it is not difficult for a Platonic or a Hegelian idealist to mystify the universal forms and laws of nature, revealed and tested by human practice, as form of expediently operating rational will, as imprints superimposed upon the substance of nature, as products of the alienation of forms of this external will in natural matter. It was in this inverted form that idealism portrayed the real fact of human activity in relation to nature, which the theory of pre-Marxist materialism did not consider. The chief defect of all previous materialism, that of Feuerbach included, is that things, reality, sensuousness, are conceived only in the form of the object or of the contemplation, but not as sensuous human activity, practice, not subjectively. Hence, it happened that the active side, in contradistinction to materialism, was set forth by idealism, but only abstractly, since, of course, idealism does not know real sensuous activity as such. This is a quote from Karl Marx and Engels, The German Ideology, the first thesis on Feuerbach.
Yeah, we can keep going and through all the way through to originals.
Oh, I continue to the next paragraph?
Yeah, great.
Okay. Not recognizing, I continue?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. Not recognizing material practice as such, idealism knew and considered this practice merely as an outward expression of cultural activities, as an external embodiment of in the substance of the nature of those plants seemingly maturing in the recesses of creative thinking and imagination, and then disposed of with the help of human hands from outside in natural matter. Herein lies the secret of idealism, the root of all its vices, its original sin.
Thanks. So, any final?
Thanks.
Thank you very much for reading it. Or questions about any of the reading that we've done today? Lots of unsuitable substances. Okay.
I'd just like to see a clarification of this paragraph. I understand the previous paragraph about the alienation and its relation to objective idealism, but this business about outward expression of cultural activities in this last paragraph just doesn't make sense to me.
Suresh?
Yes, the thing about the previously that we were discussing about the crystallization in intellectual something, the term I'm forgetting. So I think it comes in the latter part of the essay when Ilyenkov talks about, although he says that the ideal is a very is very dialectical, it is always in motion, but he also talks about that it also so to speak has an autonomy, in the sense that the ideal also exists as in let's say an image or thought which can be worked upon and modified without really making it change in practice. In thought only it can be modified. So in that sense, I think in the previous paragraph he talks about the crystallization of the ideal. So because it is really because one peculiar feature of the ideal is that it can be worked upon without really working without with prior to prior to its embodiment in matter. It can be worked upon, and that is, I think, also this is where this whole mystery of idealism, this mysticism arises. So I think Ilyenkov is referring to that. Thank you.
Thanks. And back to Karina.
Yeah, Suresh, I absolutely, that's really brilliant what you've just said. I think working on the ideal, the mediations within the ideal and how they relate to the real. It's what Ilyenkov is trying to investigate this. I'm sorry not everybody's actually spoken and we haven't heard from one or two people, but hopefully they'll speak next time. And just to say, well, first of all, thank you all of you. I think it's been an amazing discussion. And just to talk about